Hello, BookTube. This is the Rambling Raconteur, Jack. And I was thinking as I started reading the next book for 2020 yesterday, after finishing The Romantic by Herman Brock, that it's absolutely unrealistic to imagine that I'll be finishing a book every day or even every other day, and sharing thoughts around that. And I average maybe uh, one a week during really busy times, two or even three, depending on the length, obviously, of the book and what else is going on in life with my family, with my daughters and their exciting activities and development with work, with different trips we take. And so, one of the things, though, that I have always done, I shouldn't say always, one of the things that I've been doing since I became a father 3.5 years ago, and even a little bit before that, as I was taking on more responsibilities at work, was I recognized I couldn't finish the novels I was starting in a timely manner, and I had to kind of start over or start rereading. And so I started reading more and more short stories, and I really, really found that I love good short stories. I love dipping into them and exploring what they bring to literature, and they can be very, very different from what novels elicit in our minds and emotionally, as we're encountering those two different types of texts. And I had first really started in reading short stories of my own volition during college, because there were a couple of writers I was interested in who pretty much only wrote short stories, and I'll talk about that in a different video. But as I've progressed in life, and I've found there are the days or the weeks where I don't have a lot of time to sit and read for even an hour, or even 30 minutes. What I can do is find a volume of short stories, and I'll pick one up and just read one story. And I kind of keep in touch with the part of me that loves to read, but I'm also not finding that I'm compromising the other parts of my life that are really important, and honestly more important than the parts of my life that involve reading. So what I was thinking was, to connect all of that back together, is it might be fun to, when I'm not finishing a novel, highlight a particular short story and just elicit some discussion around that. I've been I've been watching BookTube videos for the past 7 months, and I don't see a lot around short stories, and I think that they're in a particular art form that will have more and more value as we progress, especially with technology. And I'll again discuss more of that in later videos. I don't want this to just be about Jack's opinions on short stories. Nevertheless, I want to sort of bring two ideas before I discuss a particular story. One is the idea that we don't always value short stories. I think because we think artistically that something that is larger is automatically better, and that there are aspects of that that may be true, but there are aspects of that that are utterly ridiculous. For example, in athletics, if I asked who is an Olympic champion, male or female, marathoner, or 10,000 meter runner, or 5,000 meter runner, or even the 1,500 meter runner, I don't think most people could give an answer. But if I asked, hey, who's an Olympic champion in the 100 meter sprint in track and field, a lot of people could say Usain Bolt from throughout the past decade. A lot of people would know that, and so there are parts of our life where we really do focus on what is short and value that versus what is long. And I wonder sometimes if it's because individuals who do have the discipline to read and read extensively want to embed more and impute more value to the time they're putting into reading, and it's more significant if they're reading something that's longer and grander, like a novel. And it's one idea. What I find really valuable about a good short story is that it's kind of like, the story is a bit like a puzzle, and you're given a glimpse of the puzzle. You're given one corner, and maybe part of it's filled in, but the story leaves a missing piece, and maybe there's a couple more pieces on the edge or an extraneous piece out here. So you're given this snapshot that shows something going on in a world, in a universe, but you're not given all the information. And what's so amazing about that is it almost, to me, activates a different part of my mind. Instead of exploring a world and just diving in and having so much of it there for me to encounter like a massive buffet that's set out, instead I'm given only a taste of that world. I'm given just a part of it, and there's a few pieces in there that are connected, but there are pieces that are missing, and I have to use my own imagination, my own mind, to fill that in, to ask questions, to make inferences. And so short stories, despite their length, can really be very demanding cognitively, and just grab onto a different piece of our mind and our heart and run with that. So one story I want to highlight just for this first one, I wanted to go with a well-known short story writer, is Anton Chekhov, and one of the true short story masters, writing at the end of the 19th century in Russia. And he has a number of absolutely brilliant stories, but I wanted to look at one called The Darling. It's a later story. Chekhov died from tuberculosis in his early 40s, and this was written just about 4 or 5 years before he ultimately passed away. And it's set in a Russian town that it's sort of like a village. Again, Chekhov doesn't tell us a huge amount about this town. There is a passage later on where we find out that the town has grown, but it's not in a major city. It's not in Moscow or St. Petersburg. And so it has this character who, Olenka, who is seems to be simple-minded. The narration suggests, and other characters within the story suggest that she doesn't really have any opinions of her own. As an example, when she marries a lumber worker, initially she's married to a theater manager, and she will sort of repeat the statements he makes about complaining about what the people want and what the audiences want, and nobody's coming to the theater. And she repeats that within the story's narrative out when she's out shopping or around the town. And so then she has married a lumber worker, and as a married couple, Pustovalov and Olenka got on very well together. As a rule, he was in the lumberyard till dinner time. Then he went out on business and was replaced by Olenka, who stayed in the office till evening, making out bills and seeing that orders were shipped. "We pay 20% more for lumber every year," she would say to customers and acquaintances. "Why, we used to deal in local timber, and now Vasishka has to travel to the province of Mogilev for timber regularly. And the freight rates," she would exclaim, putting her hands to her cheeks in horror. "The freight rates!" It seemed to her that she had been in the lumber business for ages, that lumber was the most important, the most essential thing in the world, and she found something intimate and touching in the very sound of such words as beam, log, batten, plank, boxboard, lathe, scantling, slab. And we see that she dreams about this aspect. And those are phrases her new husband has said. And so there's this sense that Olenka doesn't really have opinions or a mind of her own. And that's sort of the surface level of the short story narrative. But we realize there's something more going on, that even though that's what the other villagers believe, Chekhov intimates that the writer shouldn't believe that. And so we see that the town grows, and Olenka is experiencing, the darling is Olenka, is experiencing these life changes where she's absolutely adores her father, and her father becomes ill and passes away. She absolutely adores her first husband. He passes away. And this continues with seemingly everyone in her life who she gravitates to and loves. Something bad happens, and she's left and just seems to have, while she's adopted their opinions when they pass away, she suddenly seems to have this void, nothing of her own. And it's suggested that this character has no real mind of her own, no volition of her own. But that's not true. We start to see other changes occurring. And with that, the town occurs. So little by little, the town was extending in all directions. The Gypsy Road was now a regular street. And where the Tivoli had been and the lumber yards, houses had sprung up and lanes had multiplied. How swiftly time passes. Olenka's house had taken on a shabby look. The roof was rusty, the shed sloped, and the whole yard was invaded by burdock and stinging nettles. Olenka herself had aged and grown homely. And so we see Chekhov has that masterful, in just a few short sentences he's shown us, time has passed, how the settings changed, how Olenka, the darling of the title, she's changing with the setting. Perhaps inversely, the town's growing, but her life seems to be more and more lonely, more and more empty. and the irony, the contrast in that is very humane. He's never insulting this character. And I think that's masterful as a writer. He's not insulting this character. In that earlier reference, he throws in that little bit that even though he's showing her repeating phrases that other male characters are sharing, she's able to sit and work out bills and work out orders at the lumberyard in the evening, and she's trusted to do that, and she's competent to do that. And so on the surface level, the reader's thinking, this poor lonely woman who's just so empty and bereft. But really, there is a level of competence within her, and a level that she is making choices, that she's not simply just thrown back and having all these things happen to her, that there's much more to her mind and her character than what we originally saw. And then what's particularly fascinating is that right at the end of the story, Chekhov does this little twist. And I'm not talking an O. Henry twist or some of those other short story writers where they have the twist ending. And so you read it once and you've essentially read it, and there's not much of a need to reread it because it was all about the twist. Well, Chekhov's not doing that type of twist. His twist is that he has paragraphs that are all in past tense. Olenka chatted, she now had, Sasha started going to school, his mother went off to Kharkov. So there's all these past tense, and then suddenly, right in the final two and a quarter pages, for 6 months now, Sasha has been living in her wing. Every morning, Olenka comes into his room. He is fast asleep, his hand under his cheek, breathing quietly. She is sorry to wake him. And so, after about 12 pages, suddenly the narrative shifts, it's in the present tense. And it's such a subtle shift, because Olenka seems the same. A veterinary character who has been in her life and is now back, and it has sort of been a lodger in her house, he's pretty much the same character. His son Sasha, when we were introduced to him, that Sasha is the same Sasha that we see right here at the end, but we're suddenly in the present tense. And so Chekhov has shifted our perception of who these characters are. It was a story that we were reading that seemed to just be unfolding, and this was all something that happened. It all happened, a long time ago in a village far, far away, or in a village down over there. But suddenly it's happening now. And there's a final bit that's particularly perceptive, and I think that speaks to us in our modern times. And so Olenka is taking Sasha to school, and he walks down the street to school, a small boy in a big cap with his books in a rucksack. Olenka followed him noiselessly. "Sashenka!" she calls after him. He turns around and she thrusts a date or caramel into his hand. When they turn into the school lane, he feels ashamed at being followed by a tall, stout woman. He looks around and says, "You'd better go home, Auntie. I can go on alone." And so we still see that now. I have daughters, and we joke. My wife and I joke about what it will be like when the two of us are embarrassing them out in public, just to be seen with them. And so Chekhov taps into these universal emotions and experiences in such a humane way, in such a generous way that we don't often find in narratives. He's not patronizing his characters, and because of the inferences and the way he demands that readers use our minds, he's not patronizing us as readers. And I think that's something that is so rare in writing in general, but particularly in a short story. One of the beautiful things is that it's all so compressed that there's a demand for inference. There's a demand to use the reader's imagination to fill in those blanks or to explore what happens next. We're not told what ultimately happens to the darling Olenka or to her relationship with this boy she's helping to raise, who's not even her son, Sasha. We're not really told what's going to happen there. We get to imagine what happens there. And we're not told enough to know in a sort of deterministic way what will happen. Again, we get to use our imagination to explore and be curious around what could happen. And that's such a wonderful aspect of reading short stories. That's something that hopefully I'll be continuing to bring a couple of times a week maybe. The one goal I have is to not return to writers within the same month. But if you're interested more in short stories, highly recommend them. And in other videos, I'll talk more about sort of how I interact with stories and how I read them, why I read them, and even more ideas around that. So thank you, BookTube.